The Farmhouse from Hell by Ron Michigan. I grew up on my grandparents' farm in the thumb of Michigan in a house that dated back to the 1800s. It was an unnerving place with 2 floors and a Michigan basement layered with gray asbestos siding. Growing up, I heard a story about its past and learned firsthand that it was anything but a lie. My mother, father, aunts, and uncles all had their own experiences. They also told me the backstory of the place. After World War I, the owner of the house had just returned home. His family and friends were all glad to see him and wished to throw a celebration. That night, during the party, they ran out of wine, so since it was his home, he went to the basement to fetch more. He stored barrels of wine down there and chose to bring a full one up. The stairs that led to the basement were steep, with 13 in total, all made of concrete. As he reached the top with the barrel on his shoulder, he tripped and fell. He plummeted to the very base of the stairs onto his back, with the barrel landing on his head. It's needless to say that he didn't make it. Since that day, odd things happened in that house. My family told me stories of lights turning on and off, random footsteps, voices from nowhere, and items that would vanish and reappear in strange locations. I always felt uneasy in that house, even before I heard those stories. One night, I learned for myself that they were true. Very true. As I said, we lived with our grandparents, and space wasn't really all that available for us kids, so we were put at the end of a long hallway on the 2nd floor. The hall spanned the full length of the house, illuminated by one bulb, and one wall was lined with closets the full length. I then turned to the left into what could have been called a room. I hated that room. It was just a wide portion of the hall with no wall or door. That's where my brother and I shared a bunk bed. Our parents' room was right next to us, and I didn't typically get afraid sleeping at night. At the other end of the hall to the left, there was an old hardwood staircase, which squeaked no matter how light or quiet your steps were. My father was a farmer and often worked late to get jobs done, so I occasionally stayed up a little past my bedtime to say goodnight to him. That night was one of those nights. I would wait patiently while everyone else slept to hear the sound of his footsteps up the stairs. I assume I had been lying awake for an hour when I heard the first footstep at the base of the stairs. I lifted my head off the pillow and waited for him to come up. I waited. One more footstep slowly followed. I said, "Good night, Daddy." There was no reply. The footsteps ceased as well. At that point, I figured he had forgotten something and went back downstairs. I laid my head back down, and no more than a second later, I heard another squeaky board in the stairs creak. Then another, "Good night, Daddy," I exclaimed once more, so certain it was him. Once again, no reply, and the footsteps ceased. Being the level-headed kid I was, I thought nothing of it. Another creak changed my mind about that. I knew there were 13 stairs. I then realized that was the 5th one. If he were to have gone back down, wouldn't I have heard his steps as he descended? Another creak closer to the stop. "Daddy?" I asked in a questioning voice. No reply, yet this time the footsteps didn't stop. No, they seemed faster in between. Harder. Creak. 7. "Daddy?" I asked as I became more frantic. Creak. 8. Creak. 9. 10. Then they stopped again. I was terrified and curious both at the same time. Nearly in tears, I asked a final time, "Daddy, is that you?" Silence was the only reply. I heard another stair begin to creak, this time very close to the top. Then another very slow creak. 12. 13. From where I was laying and how my bed was set up, I could clearly see down the other end of the hall. To the right of the stairs was a window bringing in the bluish light from outside. It was then that I first saw it. It seemed to float from the top of the stairs as it blocked out most of the eerie light coming from the window. It was a tall, black, partially transparent figure with a hood or veil. I couldn't be sure which. It seemed to stop and stare at me, as though it did not seem to have eyes, almost as if it knew I could see it. I kept my gaze locked on it for a minute or so. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed with fear. It was then I did what any other child my age would do. I dove into the safety of my sheets. As I gathered my head, I reassured myself what I just saw was a figment of my imagination. Then I heard them again, slow at first, growing closer. Creak, creak, creak. My dad came up right after this. I didn't tell him what happened. I kept a lot of what I saw to myself, even though I was terrified. I just didn't want everyone to think I was crazy. Not long after my encounter with the dark figure on the stairs, I moved to another room upstairs with my brother. I still heard the occasional footsteps on the stairs as well as pounding and scratching on the walls, so I started sleeping with a nightlight. My brother wasn't so fond of it, though, and unplugged it constantly. Never was I so glad when he moved to his own room. Or so I thought. I was so happy to have a room to myself that I forgot all about the freaky things that happened regularly in that god-forsaken house. A few weeks went by and I got used to sleeping alone, until one night. My bed was set up so that the foot of it was right next to the door. It was late October and I kept the door open in the fall and winter since there was only one heat vent upstairs, and that was in the hallway. It had to have been close to 1 a.m. when I awoke from a dead sleep. There was a heavy pressure in the room, as well as being freezing cold. I opened my eyes to what appeared to be a girl about 12 years of age, standing at the foot of my bed. She was glowing with a blue hue, and she wore a tattered nightgown. She was staring, no, glaring at me. I came to completely when I realized she had no eyes, only dark, empty sockets. A sickening smile grew on her face as she hovered nearly over the bed. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, then ducked under the covers. I slowly drifted to sleep after I felt safe again. The next morning, I awoke to my sheets inexplicably pulled from the bed and slightly out the door. From that point on, the foot of my bed always faced away from the door and on the opposite side of the room, with the door to the room shut. I named her Tabitha. I was never sure why that name popped into my head, but it stuck. Many years later, I talked to my uncle about it, and he told me a story of the same sort of spirit girl who stood by his bed and watched him sleep at night in the room just down the hall from mine. He said he never felt fear when he saw her, but I strongly disagreed. Strangely enough, he called her Tabitha as well. She is a big part of all this, and I saw her many more times after this. The basement was another place I felt uneasy in, but grew accustomed to it over time. My brother and I had a cool hangout spot set up down there. We had our Nintendo and PlayStation hooked up, and often had friends over to play. One night in particular, my friend John came over. We played Rouge Trip for hours until about midnight or so, then decided to go to sleep. Rogue Trip. No, it's Rouge Trip. I can't tell. Either way, I'm getting distracted. We slept on the floor with sleeping bags. I slept soundly through the night and woke up the following mornings to see that John was missing. I looked upstairs to see that he slept up there instead. He told me that he woke up feeling like he was being watched. Then he heard what sounded like scuffling footsteps on the concrete and heavy breathing. He ran upstairs and told me he wouldn't ever sleep down there again. To be honest, I would never play down there alone, nor would I go down there by myself at night. There was always a feeling of dread and overwhelming pressure down there. You always had to look over your shoulder. The upstairs was no different as well in my grandparents' room. Let's skip ahead a few years. In 2006, on a foggy morning, a truck driver ran his truck into the side of our house. It shoved the building 14 inches off its foundation. All this happened while I was asleep right above where the truck hit. If this sounds far-fetched, I can tell you it's true. There was a headline in our local newspaper about it. As for the house, it was a total loss. We opted to build a new one about 200 feet away from it. Before the old house was finished, we had 2 mobile homes brought in and put next to the old house. My grandparents had one, and my mother, father, brother, and I shared the other. I had one experience in that as well. My best friend Josh and I came in from the barn and we walked into my bedroom at the back of the trailer. Just as we walked in, we both saw a black figure floating into the open closet. We both just stood there, dumbfounded, watching the clothes hanging up, swinging back and forth, as if it was pushed. We searched the closet and found nothing inside. A year or so later, we moved into our new house. The old one was left standing and still is to this day. Nothing too exciting happened in the new house. Life went on as usual. The move, however, took its toll on my grandparents. To think about it, all was so hard on them. They had to leave the home they built together for so many years. 6 months or so after moving, my grandfather passed first, and my grandmother less than 2 weeks later, probably because she couldn't live without him. A week or so after my grandmother's funeral, I was laying in bed almost asleep. The room was directly below mine when they were alive, and I would often hear them talk till they fell asleep. That night, I heard my grandmother crying. I listened for a few minutes thinking I was crazy, tears in my eyes. The following night, I swore I heard both of them talking again. I like to think that they found each other and went to the other side together because I never heard or felt anything strange in the new house again. This experience made me think, what if what was in the old house was the same? What if they were human souls trapped here because they couldn't find peace? I did research and got the tools needed to investigate. At first, it wasn't much, a cheap audio recorder and digital camera. My friend Johnny and I, not the same as John as before, a different guy, decided to start in the place where it all began, that damn hallway. He came over about every other night after work and we used to hang out. He always parked his car on the opposite side of the old house and walked past to the new one. He told me on several occasions he saw a small girl looking out at him through the upstairs window, on both ends of the house even. He was very curious about that. He was very curious about who she was and wanted to learn more about her, so coming along wasn't a problem. We sat in that empty hall on some old speakers with the recorder running. Not too much happened that night. We just asked the entity some questions and read an old note my brother's ex wrote to him years ago. It was so sappy that we laughed. We folded it up and placed it back where we found it. When we were communicating, I asked it to show itself and if it didn't like the flashlight being on. I shut the flashlight off, and Johnny and I just talked. Nothing more happened that night. The next day, I went over the recording. What I heard shocked me. This was my first attempt at an EVP, and it was astounding. In the part where I asked about the light bothering it, I heard a voice that wasn't ours. It said, as plain as day, "Maybe it's not just the light." I had John listen to it, and he was stunned. That night, Josh came over and wanted to go back inside the same place John and I sat the night before. As we walked into the large part of the hall, we both stopped dead with shock on our faces. The note John and I read the night before floated out of the room next to the hall down in front of our feet, unfolded. We just stared at each other in disbelief. We looked in the room there, and there was nobody there, and the only way out from there was around us. Nothing more happened that night. A week later, another friend and I went back in. This time, we sat in the basement below my grandparents' old room. During the recording, we asked it to move a battery sitting on the floor. On the recording, we heard it ask, "Over by the washer?" There was an old washing machine next to us. We also heard a chair being dragged around in my grandparents' room. We did many more investigations over the course of the next year, some in large groups too. On many occasions on the second floor, people felt the tail of their shirt tugged on, or tiny cold hands touching theirs. We had EVPs of children laughing there as well. On one occasion, we left the recorder in the hall, and we all went to the basement. After we listened to the recording, we heard a man and a woman talking. Neither voice belonged to anyone in the group. Also, you could hear the recorder being dragged around the chest it was sitting on. A week later, John and my other friend Trevor went back into my old room. It was late summer and about 70 degrees outside. We sat next to each other with our backs to the wall, facing the door from the side. Nothing too much was happening, so we just started shooting the breeze. It was then that strange things started happening. The room dropped temperature drastically. You could even see your breath. Then we all shifted our gazes to the doorway. Long, bluish figures started reaching around the door frame. Long, bluish fingers started reaching around the door frame. We sat there, staring. I asked if anyone else was seeing what I was, and they both said yes. It was at that point we all saw what appeared to be a face floating in front of us. Then it vanished. We couldn't believe what we had just seen. It was just too real. We decided to come back in the following weekend with more people. Nothing too much happened that night. We all ended up in the living room on the first floor. I sat next to the entrance to my grandparents' old room with the recorder. We talked about lots of things: life, love, jokes, you name it. It was after I began telling them about a book I had read recently that things got strange. I had finished my story and everyone laughed. We packed it in shortly after. That night, I went over the recording with everyone. We all sat in my room, bullshitting. The recording got to the part where I told my story and everyone laughed. At the end of that, the audio blanked out entirely, cutting off our voices. A loud, very pronounced, demonic laugh came through the speakers for 4 seconds or so. Then the audio continued as normal. That was enough to scare us. It was also the first time we felt real fear of the place. We backed off for a while on the investigations. A few months later, a friend of mine, who was a part of an amateur paranormal investigation team, came to me asking if they could bring a real professional team in. I said sure. They were okay investigators. They had all the equipment and even a medium. I don't believe in mediums. I find the whole idea of them to be absurd. However, this one seemed to know something we didn't. They went to the parts of the house they wanted to look into. I, for some reason, felt drawn to the basement. Stupidly, I went alone. I stood at the base of the stairs staring into the darkness, wondering why I felt drawn here. A few investigators came down to find me. We decided to have an EVP session down there. I decided to go back to the farthest corner of the basement, which you had to crawl over junk to get to. As I sat there, everyone decided to leave. I sat alone for some time listening to them upstairs. Then I heard something else. Something was rustling in the pile of junk 10 feet away. I felt fear wash over me as I realized I was all alone with no real quick escape route. The rustling started moving my way, so I ran upstairs, crashing and tripping. I knew whatever it was didn't want me down there. Also that it followed me to the stairs. The investigators said the house was haunted and left us with a warning. The medium said there was something in my grandparents' bedroom that wasn't friendly and to not provoke it. He said it was very powerful and a menacing entity. I heeded his warnings. The following weekend, my friend and his friend asked to investigate again. I told them they could, but I wasn't comfortable with it. This night would prove to be the most frightening experience of my life. My whole point of investigating it all was to learn what it was that frightened me for all those years. My friend Kyle came with us. He joined us on many investigations. He knew how uneasy I was because of what happened to me last time. We decided to stay in the dining room as they went about their business. We overheard them saying they wanted to provoke the entity in my grandparents' room. The events that followed were unexplainable. The floor plan of the first floor was like this. The dining room was the centralmost room that spanned the width of the building. To the west was the kitchen, the east was the living room. The main entrance was on the north side, coming into the dining room. The living room had no door between it and the dining room, only an archway. To the south of the living room was my grandparents' room. The door was left open. To the west of that connected the bathroom, which had a door leading to the dining room, making a loop. Directly across from that was the staircase to the upstairs. We stood near the entrance during all this. There was a huge, heavy old table in the center of the dining room right in front of us. It had a heavy tablecloth on it. The night was still without a breeze at all. Where I was standing, I could see the staircase in the living room to my left. Kyle and I were chatting as Dumb and Dumber went about provoking this entity in my grandparents' room. I caught something move out of the corner of my eye in the living room. It moved so fast and was so close to the floor. It was headed towards me. I felt it brush against my leg and looked down to see the tablecloth swaying back and forth. I looked up and felt it brush my leg again. It made its rounds back into the bedroom and back out the bathroom door. All this happened so quickly that I couldn't make heads or tails of what it was. Then I saw it. It crawled on the wall towards the stairs. Then it stopped and I saw all of it in the low light from the flashlight. It had a skinny, ragged body. Its legs were on backwards as well as its arms. As it crawled, I could see that it was looking at me, though I couldn't make out its facial features, minus the rows of jagged teeth. Then it disappeared up the stairs. Kyle saw none of this because he was texting at this moment in time. I started crying when I realized I had just been touched by something unholy. At least that's the feeling I got from it. Kyle walked me outside and asked what happened. He was honestly concerned because he had never seen me like that before. I was shaking from the fear. After that night, I never did another investigation. Also, shortly after that, the computer hard drive I kept my EVPs and pictures on burned up. I found that strange. The house still stands to this day, acting as almost a silent, petulant monolith, waiting for the next poor soul to venture inside. I enjoyed that story. Unfortunately, though, I spilled some of my tea.